I'm Chelsea Coles, and welcome to another edition of MLink News. This week, we will be talking about the integrity of a news story, as well as how you can be sure if your news source is reliable. Today, we have on the phone with us North Oakville Today journalist Emma Wolfrey. Thanks for talking with us today, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess I'll start out by asking what your experience has been and what responsibilities you take on being a public journalist.
Well, that's actually an interesting question. There are definitely a lot of responsibilities, some that a lot of people reading the newspapers don't even realize. First is obviously telling the truth. You definitely want to be truthful with what you're saying. You don't want to stretch the truth. But you also want, when telling the truth, want to keep the audience in mind and know your audience. For example, if you're writing something for a community newspaper, you want to be fair when you're writing it and not sort of insult the community, despite that maybe what you're actually thinking. You also want to monitor power, which is a big one, and that's a big responsibility for journalists, and that's sort of where investigative journalism comes into play, because the journalists are supposed to be the voice of the people, so you want to make sure that the people in charge of the people have someone controlling them, which is the job of a journalist.
All right, so what would you say the consequences or repercussions to getting something wrong in an article?
Well, obviously libel, that's probably the biggest one. If you say something about somebody that isn't true, they can sue you and you can be out of a lot of money. There's a whole bunch of steps to that I won't get into, because really only journalists are the ones that need to worry about that. But I mean, you can get fired, or you could start riots. I mean, there was that April Fool's prank where they said aliens were invading and people were freaking out and jumping off buildings. So there's definitely some consequences that go from little things like libel and the journalists losing their job all the way to people taking what you say as truth.
Okay, so obviously there are some issues with not getting your facts right. So why would you think some journalists fake facts or plagiarize or just simply be careless about certain things?
Laziness, to be honest. I mean, I don't think that there's any real excuse for it, and it's sad how many people get away with it. I think that when it's convenient for them and they want to somehow insert their opinion, but because a journalist can't really insert their opinion unless they state it's their own opinion, making up sources that have the same opinion and stories like that way they can get their opinion out without really digging and doing the work.
Makes sense. So what advice would you give to our non-journalist listeners when they are reading into the news and how to be able to tell fact from fiction?
Well, definitely, there are ways to tell that it's easy for a journalist, but for the public, start with a reliable news source. I mean, blogs, it's easy to go online and go on YouTube and go on all these different new blogging websites and read people's opinion, but if you're on a website like the Toronto Star, CBC, BBC, websites like that, that's definitely a good place to start. But if you don't have access to those, because a lot of them are starting to charge money, just when you're reading it, a good way to tell is if this opinion is in quotes, then that's a good place to start.
Amazing. That is great advice. Well, that's all the time we have here with Emma. So thank you so much for taking the time and answering these questions for us. I know our listeners will be very grateful.
Oh, no problem.
Terrorism, or just plain insanity. Tune in next week when we dive into the Boston Marathon bombing and look at what really happened. I'm Chelsea Coles with MLink News. Thanks for tuning in.